Johnston joins me now in the studio. Tim, it turns out that police have been listening in for years.
Afternoon, Gemma. Yeah, pretty extraordinary stuff, and elaborate, I think, doesn't barely begin to cut it when we're talking about this kind of technology. I mean, essentially, the AFP today have said that this is a plan that was hatched out over a couple of beers a few years ago between the AFP and the FBI in the wake of them shutting down more or less similar technology that was used by alleged criminals. So, in this instance, they've essentially used high-profile criminals who've then unwittingly distributed mobile phones that have a particular app that was installed by FBI called Anom on it. And these are the devices that they've then gone out to use and carry on fairly candid conversations about their operations, and now in some instances for several years. So the AFP Commissioner ran us through sort of some of the brazen language that was used on many of these devices, which gave them an insight to a very, very wide range of offending. So here in Australia, since the operation began, they've picked up more than 200 offenders, and across those that spans around 525 charges. But ultimately they say that they've stopped a whole range of activity from drug importation as well as drug distribution in Australia, as well as even then to some serious extents of threats to kill and perhaps even murder here in Australia. So the Prime Minister says that ultimately this is a very significant day announcing this operation.
Today the Australian Government, as part of a global operation, has struck a heavy blow against organised crime, not just in this country, but one that will echo around organised crime around the world. This is a watershed moment in Australian law enforcement history.
Essentially, we have been in the back pockets of organised crime and operationalised a criminal takedown like we have never seen. The use of encrypted communication apps presents significant challenges to law enforcement, and Anom has given law enforcement a window into the level of criminality that we have never seen before on this scale.
Tim, how has this disrupted criminal networks?
Well, I mean, both internationally and nationally. So, I mean, this is a massive international operation that then ended up using the sort of backdoor, I guess, into these networks, looking at their operations. So that involved about 9,000 law enforcement officers across the world, rather. So, but also when we're looking nationally, it's disrupted in many different ways. There's been very significant seizures of drugs, of weapons, as well as cash in the last few years as a result of using this technology. There's been hundreds of different search warrants that were executed as part of this operation in recent days. So it's exposed many links from Australian operations to overseas. We've also seen senior bikies arrested across the country just in the last 2 days or so, and it's given officers a lot of intelligence on drug importation. So ultimately, using this kind of technology has shown, people, engaging in illicit criminal activity that perhaps where they thought that they were safe, they may not be.
Criminals should be on notice that law enforcement and partnerships all over the world are resolute in their dedication to collaboration and to continue to evolve our capabilities. And for any organization to function, no matter what it is, legitimate, criminal, or otherwise, the members of that organization have to be able to communicate. And all of those communications cannot be in person.
So while there's significant disruption there, though, we have heard from New South Wales Police that for them, ultimately, this is just the beginning. They've started bolstering a lot of their services in recent years, Strike Force Raptor, to name one, to ultimately now deal with some of the fallout from these kinds of arrests. They say that there will likely be reprisals as a result of many of these arrests and debts owed and the like. So, while this is a pretty significant scoop today, it does sound like there's more to go and plenty more arrests down the track.
Reporter Tim Swanston, thank you. Health authorities are still trying to find the link between the hotel quarantine case and Melbourne community cases. Despite this, health authorities remain confident that Victoria is on track to experience further easing of restrictions on Thursday. Stephanie Ferrier reports.
Health and government officials have identified an exact genomic match with this so-called West Melbourne cluster, which involves the highly infectious Delta strain. Now, at the moment, they're still trying to work out an epidemiological link between this traveller aged in his 40s and a missing link potentially out there in the community. They believe that there could just be one person. Now, this man arrived in Melbourne on a flight from Sri Lanka on May the 8th. There were 24 other people on the plane. They've all tested negative. Then he was testing positive on that same day and was moved the following day from the Ibis Novotel hotel off to the Holiday Inn Medical Hotel. There were around 650 staff at quarantine, as well as the Sky Bus drivers. They have all tested negative on those dates, the people that were working there, and also the people who were on the same floor. Around 12 people have also tested negative. But the Quarantine Minister, Danny Pearson, says they are now currently reviewing all of the operations there at those two hotels just to try to find this missing link.
While we are continuing to review CCTV and incident logs again, I can also confirm that so far there is no reported or obvious breach of infection prevention control protocols or anything else that would indicate a transmission has happened inside the hotel.
Deputy Chief Health Officer Professor Alan Cheng says that there are 4 possible theories as to how this virus jumped into the community. 2 of those are not as likely. That is that it could have happened from the plane and also after this man was finally released from hotel quarantine on the 23rd of May. He says that it's more likely that it could have come when either another person who was in hotel quarantine or a member of the staff was infected during hotel quarantine. He says that they're also rechanging their potential timeline as well as a result of this testing. They now believe that it wasn't the family that travelled up to southern New South Wales, I should say, and came back. It could have actually been another family at North Melbourne Primary School that infected that family first. So as a result of that, they're now looking at putting into quarantine a whole extra cohort, grade 3s and 4s. They will have to quarantine for 14 days. But he does say that this at least gives them a reassuring picture of exactly when this began and the fact that it hasn't been out there in the community for very long. And they also can now start looking upstream as to where exactly this jumped into the community.
I'm very surprised it got out, but this is what we have, and we need to try and work out exactly what's happened here. This also does mean that we have a start time for the outbreak, so we now know that it couldn't have been in Victoria before the 8th of May, and that is significant because it means that there's unlikely to be very widespread transmission for a long period of time before this outbreak was detected in North Melbourne.
So he says that barring any late developments that we don't know about over the next few days, we do remain on track to come out of lockdown here in Melbourne at midnight on Thursday. And that is a view that is echoed by the acting Premier James Merlino. But today he wouldn't be drawn on whether or not that announcement would officially be made tomorrow.
I can't foreshadow anything today other than to reassure all Victorians that today doesn't change our plans. We remain on track to provide further easing of restrictions in regional Victoria and careful easing of restrictions in Melbourne. So we remain absolutely on track to deliver that.
He says that's due to the excellent work of contact tracers being able to keep a lid on this highly infectious strain downstream. But he wouldn't be drawn on exactly what restrictions we might face once we come out of lockdown. The question was specifically put to him about what happens to remote learning for Melbourne school children, and he said he could not foreshadow what changes would happen in that regard.
The West Australian Government is expanding its vaccine program beyond the current limits of the federal government's rollout. Premier Mark McGowan has announced residents aged over 30 will now be able to get the COVID-19 vaccination.
Western Australians aged between 30 and 49 will be able to get the COVID-19 vaccination with bookings opening today. We are fast-tracking the rollout of the COVID-19 vaccination program, offering the vaccine to all eligible West Australians over the age of 30. This means those aged between 30 and 49 will receive the Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine at state-run clinics starting this Thursday, the 10th of June. And people aged over 50 will continue to receive the AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccine.
From today in the Northern Territory, anyone over 16 can book in for a COVID-19 vaccination. Darwin is the first capital city in the country to offer the vaccine to over 16s. Reporter Nicholas Hines has more from Darwin.
Appointments have been filling quickly here at the Royal Darwin Hospital Vaccine Centre since the expansion of the Territory's vaccine rollout this morning. People young and old have been queuing up to get their jabs now that anyone over the age of 16 in the Northern Territory is eligible. Health Minister Natasha Fyles says the change has been made because the Territory has confidence in the supply, with increasing coronavirus vaccines headed to the Territory and a need to quickly vaccinate the entire community, given the significant vulnerable Indigenous population across the NT. But for those people getting their vaccine here today, it's also a sign of hope that things might return to normal sooner rather than later.
It's great that younger Territorians are now eligible to do their bit and get vaccinated. Even though the risk is lower to them, it protects our whole of communities.
I think the Territory is the best place in Australia right now, and this is proof of that, being able to get the vaccine so early.
Health authorities say plans are underway for a mass vaccination clinic to open in Darwin in the coming weeks, which will see thousands of doses administered in the months ahead. So far, more than 50,000 doses have been administered in the Territory, with more than 13,000 people fully vaccinated. Health Minister Natasha Fyles says everyone in the Territory should get a jab before the end of the year.
Friends of an asylum seeker family being held on Christmas Island have questioned the time it took for authorities to address the suspected serious illness of the youngest child. The 3-year-old girl was medically evacuated to Perth last night. Erin Semler reports.
It's a gloomy day here in the central Queensland town of Biloela, the adopted home of the Tamil asylum seeker family who've been held in immigration detention since 2018. The youngest Australian-born daughter, Tarnika, was flown to a Perth hospital from Christmas Island with her mother, Priya, last night after being unwell for almost 2 weeks. Family friends say they're concerned about how long it took authorities to address the 3-year-old's suspected serious illness. Angela Fredericks says Tarnika has a blood infection caused by untreated pneumonia, and further tests are underway.
I feel the medical staff connected to the IHMNS service absolutely failed this family.
The Australian Border Force says it strongly denies any allegations of inaction or mistreatment of individuals in its care and facilitates access to nurses, doctors and specialists for all members of the family. The Department of Home Affairs says all decisions were based on clinical knowledge by a medical practitioner. Ms Fredericks says Tarnika's parents had been pushing for staff at the detention centre to do more than supply paracetamol, but their requests were not taken seriously.
If the family were in Biloela, they would have been able to take Tarnika to the hospital on day 2 or 3 of symptoms, not have to wait till day 12.
Lawyers have been calling on the federal government to immediately release them from detention since a court ruling in February was upheld, leaving them in limbo on Christmas Island. While the complex legal battle continues, it's likely Tarnika will celebrate her 4th birthday on Saturday, separated from her father and older sister who remain on Christmas Island.
The federal government says it's looking at resettlement options for the family. Home Affairs Minister Karen Andrews says broader policy changes could affect the decision.
We are going through the process now of investigating a range of resettlement options in relation to a number of different circumstances here in Australia. I can't make public commentary on that at the moment because I don't want to disrupt those negotiations.
The Benrobert Smith defamation case has ended its 2nd day, with the federal court hearing details of his lost income. He's suing 3 newspapers over stories that allege he committed war crimes in Afghanistan. Senior court reporter Jamelle Wells is there. Jamelle, what did the court hear today about his income loss?
Well, Gemma, today his barrister Bruce McClintock said Benrobert Smith to date has lost around $475,000 since these newspaper stories came out. Now, he said his average income is around $320,000 a year, and the court heard today that an accountant will be one of the witnesses called to give evidence. We heard today that a large amount of that money comes from his public speaking engagements, and Mr McClintock said today no one wants to hire a public speaker who's accused of domestic violence and of war crimes and murder in Afghanistan. Now, we also heard today that he had been offered a very lucrative partnership in a high-profile accounting firm, but that's been put on hold since these stories about him came out in the Sydney Morning Herald, The Age and the Canberra Times around 2018. Now, interestingly today, Gemma, the court heard a little bit of argument about caps on defamation payouts, and Mr McClintock said he's going to try to have the cap that currently exists lifted. Now, we haven't heard an exact figure of the amount of money that Benrobert Smith is claiming from these newspapers, but Jeffrey Rush, for example, recently was awarded almost $3 million. He currently holds the record for a single-person defamation payout.
And are we any closer to knowing when witnesses will start giving evidence?
Well, Gemma, we heard today that Mr Robert Smith will be the first witness and he'll be called up tomorrow sometime. We also heard today about the accountant who'll be giving evidence, and we know that Mr Robert Smith's evidence is likely to take 3 or 4 days, and then he'll be followed by a series of witnesses, 60 in total. Some of those soldiers that he's fought with in Afghanistan, some will be giving evidence from Afghanistan through a translator. We also heard today that the former Governor-General, Quintin Bryce, is not going to give evidence, but we heard that's because it's for personal reasons, and that she hasn't withdrawn her support for Benrobert Smith. She still stands by him in this.
And finally, Jamel, how much compensation is Benrobert Smith seeking?
Well, as I mentioned, Gemma, we haven't been given an exact figure, but to go by the amounts of money we've heard in court today, we've heard that his income lost so far is $475,000. Then you would imagine there'll be hundreds of thousands of dollars of legal fees because he's got a very high-profile legal team representing him in this matter. And the single biggest payout to date has been, for a defamation case, has been the actor Jeffrey Rush, and he received nearly $3 million. So one would imagine that Benrobert Smith legal team will be asking for an amount well over $1 million, and just to cover the legal fees and his lost income and also his future earnings. The court heard today that there's going to be some sort of claim for that as well.
Jamel Wells in Sydney, thank you. Afghan translators employed by Australian troops have been placed on a Taliban kill list for working alongside so-called infidel enemies over the past 20 years. The ABC has obtained a copy of a recent letter believed to be signed by a Taliban commander threatening the life of a former interpreter who is trying to flee the war-torn country. Defence correspondent Andrew Green has more from Canberra.
In the past, Australia has brought some of these Afghan staff to this country for safety, but it's believed around 300 of these former interpreters are still in the war-torn country, and their dependents, of course, and there's now an urgent effort to get them out and to the safety of Australia with a protection visa. Former Defence Force personnel are leading this push, and the ABC has obtained, as you say, a copy of a letter that appears to show the very real danger some of these people are facing from the Taliban as coalition forces withdraw from that country. Let's hear from a couple of veterans who are leading this push.
I remain hopeful that, but the window of opportunity to do that and to make sure that we get those individuals out safely is rapidly closing.
We can have a team on the ground over there to start acting, representing these people, putting their paperwork, processing their paperwork quickly and accurately to take the load off governments.
The government has been facing a lot of pressure on this very issue in recent days and weeks because other coalition nations, such as the United States, are making very high-profile efforts to get their former Afghan staff out of the country. But the Prime Minister, for the first time in recent months, was asked about this very issue. This was his response.
We are very aware of it, and we are working urgently and steadfastly and patiently to ensure that we do this in the appropriate way, as we have done on earlier occasions.
The Prime Minister giving a very broad hint there that an operation is probably already underway to get many of these Afghan interpreters out of the country. And overnight, we also heard an official statement from the Taliban assuring former personnel who worked with coalition forces that they are safe once the coalition allies leave. But given what we've uncovered recently, those assurances are not being taken very seriously.
Let's get the finance news now. Here's Alicia Barry. Alicia, business trading conditions at record levels.
They certainly are, and for the second month in a row, NAB's monthly business survey for May shows that business conditions hit a fresh record high, and all of the subcomponents, if you like, were at record levels as well. They are forward orders, employment, profitability and trading conditions, with trading conditions now at exceptional levels according to NAB. Business confidence did edge a little lower in the month, and that had a lot to do with the fact that Melbourne went into lockdown at the end of the month. But despite falling, business confidence is still at elevated levels, reaching a record high last month. So NAB says, taken together, the survey results over the past 2 months point to further growth in the economy in this quarter, following last week's national accounts, which show GDP has now risen above its pre-COVID level. Well, superannuation funds are increasingly influencing how listed companies approach issues like climate change and gender diversity. That's because they own around 20% of stake in combined entities trading on the stock exchange. But the federal government is now looking to regulate that influence, particularly their proxy advisors, a move business lobby groups are in favour of. Nasim Kadem reports.
Debbie Blakey is the boss of $60 billion super fund Hester. It holds big stakes in publicly listed companies and is one of many large investors holding board directors to account.
When we invest in companies, we seek to engage with them. We see ourselves as active owners.
That's a dramatic power shift from 20 years ago. Now ordinary workers call the shots via industry super funds, and many of those funds take advice on who should sit around board tables from so-called proxy advisors. There are 4 main players in Australia. They make recommendations to super funds about whether company directors should be re-elected over issues like executive pay, gender diversity and climate change. Now, proxy advisors like Louise Davidson from the Australian Council of Superannuation Investors are under attack and facing a raft of new regulations.
Our discussions with companies then go to inform what would be our voting advice that we would provide to our members. Do we think that they should support the re-election of a particular director?
Dissent in capitalism is a good thing. Criticism is a good thing. And we should be promoting people's entitlement to actually give that feedback.
Lawyer Jeremy Liebler, who acts on behalf of company directors, has been talking to the Treasurer about the need for greater scrutiny of proxy advice.
It's not about shutting down criticism, but it shouldn't be based on an unchecked, unregulated power that is followed blindly.
Company directors have been long complaining about the influence of proxy advisors. In 2017, corporate watchdog ASIC did a review of the sector, but it found no regulation was needed and that shareholders should be free to exercise their right to vote. A spokesman for Treasurer Josh Frydenberg says the proposed regulation follows reforms in the United Kingdom and the United States to strengthen oversight and accountability. Ms Blakey hopes investors will still be able to freely seek advice.
Whether it's managing environmental, social governance risks in the portfolio, whether it's the appointment of directors, these decisions will have a material impact on the future financial outcomes of members.
In recent years, there have been numerous cases where industry super funds have called the shots. When AMP promoted Bo Pahari to the head of AMP Capital, the controversy led to the resignation of Chairman David Murray and Pahari's departure.
Promoting someone to the position of CEO who had been involved in that sexual harassment issue really had concern for us. And the result, of course, of those engagements, not just Hester, but very broadly, was that AMP made some decisions about how they did actually have to make changes to meet community expectations.
Expectations that investors hope they can continue to hold companies to account on.
The Australian share market has dipped into the red, or it's been bouncing in and out of the red as mining stocks weigh on the market. Right now, the All Ords is managing a few gains. The ASX and the All Ords up around 1/5% each. Health and tech stocks are the ones that are performing the most strongly. Biotech Mesoblast is benefiting from its Wall Street counterparts rallying overnight and a broker upgrade. WiseTech Global and Nearmap aren't too far behind. And after hitting a high on takeover talk yesterday, tech company Altium is returning some ground, while NEWSABC is in the corporate regulators' sights over whether it overstated forecasts ahead of its listing in an investigation that's been running for a few weeks. Turning across the region, and the NZ50 is bucking the downward trend, managing some modest gains. Japan's Nikkei has dipped despite the country's first quarter GDP contracting by less than originally anticipated. On Wall Street, shares were mostly lower, but only marginally, with the Dow and the S&P losing ground, while biotechs helped lift the Nasdaq. And the muted end to trade came despite an announcement by the G7 over the weekend that it had agreed to back a minimum global corporate tax rate of at least 15%. On commodities markets, both spot gold prices and crude oil prices are on the retreat, and the Australian dollar is also losing a little ground against the greenback, sitting just below 77.5 US cents. And that is all from the finance desk for now. Gemma.
Thanks, Alicia. In the 4 months since the Myanmar